Hello, it's the Happy Hermit here to talk to you about life, literature, and everything else under the sun. One theory I've always run is that too much wealth makes people crazy. Keep in mind, I'm not talking about merely being rich, but having excessive affluence to such a degree that you don't interact with the regular world anymore. Any kind of disconnection creates imbalance, because mental health partially comes from having a give-and-take relationship with your environment. When it's all give, like being in poverty, or when it's all take, like having endless wealth, people become unstable. Adults aren't all that different from children in the sense that when they get whatever they want with little effort, they become spoiled and flabby, no longer able to make good decisions because they don't have any concept of consequences. It's one reason why spoiled people shouldn't run things. Give a 3-year-old a porcelain dish and they'll smash it because that's more fun and they have no concept of its value. Caroline Blackwood, heiress of the Guinness fortune, comes from such a background of wealth, and while Great Granny Webster isn't an autobiography because Blackwood runs in high society, she would certainly have enough experience to make her fictional characterizations credible. First off, let's look at the book's description. Quote, Great Granny Webster is Caroline Blackwood's masterpiece. Heiress to the Guinness fortune, Blackwood was celebrated as a great beauty and dazzling raconteur long before she made her name as a strikingly original writer. This macabre, mordantly funny, partly autobiographical novel reveals the gothic craziness behind the scenes in the great houses of the aristocracy, as witnessed through the unsparing eyes of an orphaned teenage girl. Great Granny Webster herself is a fabulous monster, the chilliest of matriarchs, presiding with steely self-regard over a landscape of ruined lives. End quote. Great Granny Webster has a stern Victorian attitude of how things should be done that are unrelated to practicality or comfort. She won't use central heating because it's common. She talks about the servants like they're a different species. She fusses about what will happen to her archaic 4-poster bed after she dies. The book describes her scathingly. Quote, The house of Great Granny Webster gave out the same damp feeling of cold that one experiences in many churches. We used to eat our meals on trays in front of the fire, but the chill of those meals was increased by the fact that for reasons of economy, the fire was laid but never lit. In a period of post-war austerity, Great Granny Webster managed to make the meals she served seem far more austere and rationed than anyone else's. This had something to do with the way her food was always served on her own priceless silver, which was polished every day in the basement by a crippled maid, whom she called by her surname, Richards. Great Granny Webster's tiny pats of margarine, when they were carried in by Richards laid out on a large silver-engraved butter dish, looked so diminished by their expensive setting as to appear non-existent. The saccharine she always served instead of sugar looked equally shamed and reduced by the immensely valuable bowl that held it, and the same diminishment would befall her stingy and minute portions of rubbery, unseasoned canned spaghetti, which only seemed to speck the huge gleaming surface of the banquet platter on which it would appear, looking much less like food than some unfortunate little accident that flawed the beauty of her silver, a tiny whitish excrescence that Richards should have cleaned. End quote. This is a perfect metaphor for Granny Webster, a silver platter that is giving out as little as possible. She spends her days sitting in the dark in a posture chair, doing almost nothing. She doesn't read, she doesn't like discussion. If she says anything, it tends to be criticism and does not wish to have any response. There's a certain level of masochistic satisfaction from making everything a duty, to serve food that is barely edible, and to go on car rides for fresh air with the window open only a tiny crack. The unnamed narrator is spending time there due to a respiratory illness, where she's getting some sea air, but must spend time sitting silently in Granny Webster's parlor, just watching the clock tick. To Granny Webster, this is the proper way for ladies to spend their time. As a woman of wealth, your status came from not having to do chores or childcare, but in being idle. To be the one who doesn't do things, but tells other people to do things. The unnamed narrator's experience with her great-grandmother leads her to examine the similar inflexibility of the rest of her extended family, all in a similar situation, silver platters that have little to offer in their own way. Let's look at the other members of the family one by one. First, we get Aunt Lavinia, an aging vamp. At first glance, she seems to be the opposite of Great Granny Webster, a carefree anti-mame type who lives off the goodwill of her former wealthy lovers and lives a pampered existence. The problem is her whole carefree persona is just as inflexible. She talks about suicide and assault in a mental institute with the same happy-go-lucky tone as she talks about her dog, Poo-Poo. As we get to know Lavinia, she becomes more and more disturbing as she talks about a botched suicide attempt with the annoyed tone of a missed flight. She eventually succeeds. She has only one way to interact with the world, through this fluffy persona, and can only be a flat character without subtlety or the ability to change. She has the same obdurance that Great Granny Webster. Nothing the world throws at her changes Lavinia's basic forms of interactions one iota. One person we do need to put to the side is the narrator's father. One reason the narrator is reaching out to these relatives is she's trying to figure out what kind of person her father was. He had died in World War II when she was a small child, so she didn't know him. One thing she's particularly confused about is that he visited Great Granny Webster regularly, which to the narrator seems to be unthinkable to want to spend time with a harridan like that. The problem is that her relatives are so generally unreflective and self-absorbed, they're fundamentally unable to talk to her about anything but themselves. Here's his description in the book. Quote, "My father had been killed in Burma when I was 9, and I found it almost impossible to remember what he had been like. Death had obscured him as a reality and turned him into a phantom who remained completely elusive because his image was always in a state of flux. He had become for me nothing more than a fluid, shifting composite of memory and fantasy, in which sometimes he could appear glorified and attractive, at other times much less so. I could remember a black-haired man playing tennis in white flannels, a black-haired man flushed from drinking port, as he shouted and argued with his Oxford friends. The man seemed very ancient, but I realized that even this had to be a distortion, because at the time he had still been in his 20s. I found I could remember the smell of his tobacco when he came to my bedroom to say goodnight, that he had once told me to read Shakespeare because when I grew up and was very unhappy, I would find every kind of human unhappiness perfectly expressed there. But all these memories were so arbitrary, misty, and superficial that they had no way added up to any kind of satisfactory portrait, and they would all seem to be completely blotted out by a much more vivid, cleanly etched and final image of 3 brown telegrams from the War Office, the first announcing his death, the second regretting the error and denying it, the third regretting that His Majesty had to confirm the information on the first." End quote. It's interesting this description comes in the middle of the book, his family portrait becoming a big question mark. Throughout the book, this image does not change, but gets reinforced by all her questions about everybody else. His role as the question mark is set and cannot be altered. Any new information just feeds into his role as the question mark man. This book shows wealth as a sort of tomb that memorializes a person before they're dead. No longer human beings, but posed cadavers with detailed personas that they do not veer from no matter what. Dunmartin, her grandfather, was the image of an Edwardian country squire who would spend his days hunting or in his study. He had a manor, but the manor was a complete wreck, with holes in the ceiling big enough to leave enough standing water on the floors that the servants had to wear galoshes going about their duties. The people hired to cook didn't know how, so served inedible meals of burnt, hunted pheasant. He insisted that menus be chosen by his wife and written out in French, even though nobody in the household knew how to read it. His wife, who we'll refer to as grandmother, had mental health issues to such a severe level that she thought she was a fairy and threatened to kill her own grandson at his christening. Here's a description of her being presented with the menus. Quote, "When my grandmother heard the footman knocking on the bedroom door, she reacted in different ways, depending on the mood she happened to be in when he arrived. Some mornings she asked him to come in. She would take the menus from him and, while he waited uneasily, glance down them with the unseeing eyes of someone in a dream, and finally place a few impatient random ticks next to some of the names of the French dishes that had been suggested to her. On other mornings, the sound of his knuckles knocking with politely trained yet remorseless insistence on her door had the effect of inflaming her most paranoid and irrational terrors. Giving a piercing little scream, she would dive for cover under her bed, where she would lie quaking, with her arms clutching the cold surface of the white chamber pot, which was placed there nightly because her room was so inconveniently far from the nearest bathroom. There she would remain until Grandfather Dunmartin, looking stupefied and haggard, came in to visit her and by various reassurances, like someone oozing a pinned winkle from its shell, managed to persuade her that it was safe to come out. There were also worse occasions when her reaction to the footman's knock would be more frenetic and sinister. Making a rush at her door, she would fling it wide open and stand there with her golden hair in a disheveled mop and her breasts poking out of her slinky, silver-threaded nightgown. Glaring at the young man, she asked him what the hell he wanted and then, screaming obscenities, started to curse him for having dared to come and disturb her." End quote. The grandmother fits the role of the family lunatic, the woman locked up in the attic. In fact, after she threatens her grandson, she does end up being taken away to the city where, being in a more sociable environment, she improved for a time, but otherwise remained locked away forever. Our protagonist never learns much about her father. As to why he chose to visit Great Granny Webster on occasion, we only get guesses, and the story moves from trying to understand her father to looking in horror at the wax museum that her family tree provides. Is the narrator doomed to the same fate, stuck as a character? It's interesting that the one thing that her Aunt Lavinia and Granny Webster agree on is our narrator lacks character. In a way, it's literally true. We don't know her name and very little about her personal life. It's almost as if seeing how character has cursed the rest of her family, she seeks a sort of anonymity. Anonymity and ordinariness in this novel are blessings, for they allow people to grow and change. It's similar to the curse of fame, where once you've become known as a certain thing, you're stuck with it. And why pop culture is littered with the wrecks of former child stars and teen idols. The curse of wealth is quite similar. Not needing to change for anybody, the curse bearer becomes a crumbling statue, staying stuck in a changing world, a sphinx in the desert. We see Granny Webster's ashes being spread at the end of the story. Quote, "Earth to earth, dust to dust, but as she came streaming out of the urn, she didn't look at all like dust. That was the thing that was so very shocking. I kept expecting her ashes to be a grayish-brown, but instead they were dazzling white. There was something profoundly unsuitable and disturbing about their brilliant whiteness. There was an incongruity in the way this extreme whiteness made her appear gay and bright and festive, the very opposite of anything she had ever liked in life. In no way did it seem at all correct that Great Granny Webster should look frivolously snowy and sweet, almost exactly like castor sugar that was being poured into a bowl as an ingredient for a wedding cake. There was something very jarring and ironic in the fact that this woman, who had always insisted on eating only saccharin for reasons of economy, should be making her last earthly appearance in the guise of first-grade expensive sugar. And there seemed to be much too much of Great Granny Webster to be emptied into the ground. There was something almost obscene in the sheer quantities in which she was emerging. I'd expected the clergyman would just take one handful of her ashes and throw them into the grave as a symbol, but instead he kept impatiently tipping the urn, and his frozen face looked exasperated at the way that her white powdery substance would not stop flowing out." End quote. The funeral ends up being a cosmic joke, this miser becoming an urn of sugar that won't stop pouring its riches into the ground. Her straight-backed chair bequeathed to her humpbacked servant, the only other attendee, at a funeral that doesn't bring grief, just embarrassment as the powdery ash gets blown by the wind and covers the preacher and two mourners. Great Granny Webster is just one example of how wealth can twist people. You see it in The Great Gatsby and Great Gardens and soap operas and the news. It takes talent to acquire wealth, but that doesn't mean you have the talent for anything else. An excessive acquisition is just hoarding, an indication that something is wrong with that person. As Maurice Baring says, if you would know what the Lord God thinks of money, you only have to look at those to whom he gives it. Happy reading!